What you're about to hear is a work of fiction. In real life, the South Bend City Cemetery is closed at night, and we wouldn't dream of going in there after dark. But if we could, the air would be sharp, the kind of cold that finds the gaps in your coat and settles there. The last of the daylight would have long since bled away, leaving only the thin light of the moon and the fractured glow of street lamps far beyond the gates. The gravel path would crunch beneath our feet, loud in the quiet. Off to the left, headstones lean at odd angles like tired old men, their names worn thin by more than a century of rain. We'd pass the Colfaxes, a vice president and his mayor's son, their monument standing tall even in the dark. Then the Studebakers, whose wagons carried the city's name far beyond Indiana. A few rows over, Birdsell, the man who made threshers that fed the nation. Norman Eddy, whose hands once carried a soldier's sword and a congressman's pen. Samuel Sample, who had represented Indiana when the state was still young. And tucked among them, the McKinleys, grandparents to a future president, their stone quiet and plain, belying the history it holds. Rows of tombstones, each one a remembrance of a life, each life the keeper of a story. And if the history of this place could talk, well, according to some people, it does. And if we were out there at night, beneath a moon full and shining or dark and empty, somewhere in the dark the wind would thread through the bare branches and make a sound almost like voices. And then there's the bridge, the only pile of stones in this graveyard without anything interesting beneath it. This bridge is the last remaining remnant of Alexis Coquillard's failed Kankakee mill race. There's even a marker commemorating the grand failure of the effort to divert the flow of the Kankakee River into the St. Joseph, but it's hard to read in the dark. Anyway, we're not here to read the sign. We're here to listen and listen closely, because a long time ago, someone told me that on a quiet and still night, atop the bridge in the South Bend City Cemetery, you can hear the sounds of the water that never did run here. Close your eyes and listen close. At first, the sound might be anything, a rustle, a breeze, wind in the trees. It would be a stretch to call this noise a flow or even a trickle. But wait another moment and there's a rush, a splash, a gurgle, a current, and unmistakably the sound is coming from below, not above. You open your eyes and target your flashlight on the ground beneath you, and it's all just dirt and grass. You stop and strain to hear what you are certain you have heard, but by now the sound is gone. Just you, the bridge, and the dark. Hello and welcome to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Helman, and during this series we are going to dive into some of the spooky stories that you'll find around Michiana, from ghost stories to true crime to unbelievable myths, legends, and folklore. We will take a few historical liberties with the content of some of these stories because by nature, they're rooted in rumor and legend and not historical fact. But that doesn't mean we won't learn plenty of history along the way. And my goal is to help you learn something, stay entertained, and maybe scare you out of your socks while we're at it. During the course of this episode, you'll hear fictional advertisements for very real historical companies and products. We do that to help break up the podcast, provide some levity, to include just a little more history than we could otherwise, and to give you a sense of the time and place when and where all of this is happening. And now, with all that out of the way, we're headed off to visit just a few of the cemeteries in Michiana that have spawned legends and ghost stories for generations. And we're going to start in Little Egypt. Located southwest of Bremen, Little Egypt Cemetery is so old that the gravel of Fifth Road was literally laid around it, a camelback hump on a section of the map that is located not particularly near anything, and on a road that's not the fastest way to get anywhere. This is exactly the kind of place you would take someone to late at night if you wanted to spook them with a made-up ghost story. So you can imagine how spooky the place gets when you find out at least according to some people, that the stories aren't made up. First of all, there's the name, Little Egypt. That's what everyone calls the cemetery, but you won't find that name on a sign or on a map. Technically speaking, this is the Ewald Cemetery. As for where it got the Little Egypt name, I'm not sure. Someone told me once there was an Egypt school not too far from here. I haven't been able to verify the truth of that statement, and anyway, an inexplicable name is far from the creepiest thing about this graveyard. Today's Little Egypt Cemetery is wrapped in fencing and closed to the public, and probably for good reason. After decades of bored teenagers spent their nights testing the veracity of the ghost stories of the place, it became dangerous for all of the natural reasons, let alone the supernatural reasons. Supernatural reasons like the grave of the child who choked on the coin. The legend tells that if you place a coin on the child's headstone, you'll hear the cries of a baby. It's a tough claim to test, given that most of the stones are worn down and many have been vandalized. Another reason the graveyard is encased in chain link. Now, if it seems cruel to you to mock the ghost of the dead child by dropping coins into its eternal rest, you're not alone in thinking so, and maybe some of the other ghosts who haunt Little Egypt would agree with you. There are plenty of stories of apparitions driving unwanted visitors away from the cemetery. There have been reports of ghosts climbing trees, chasing cars, leaving handprints on the windshield. There's supposed to be a local farmer buried in this cemetery, dead of some horrific accident, and still plenty upset about it. He's been said to rise from the center of the cemetery, glowing red as fire and mad as a hornet. And then, when all of it forces you to turn and flee, you should know you're not yet home free. That's because just down the road from Little Egypt, there's a place called the Troll Bridge. The dirt road bridge is a pretty unassuming place by day, save for the graffiti that is clearly not written in any human language I've ever read. It's scarier by night, but even then the stories tell that the troll doesn't mind if you drive over his bridge so long as you keep moving. But if you stop on the bridge for any reason, well, it seems like he doesn't like that very much at all. Stories paint a not-so-specific version of this character, although it would be hard to get too accurate a description of any kind of being in the pitch dark while you are actively running away from it. The stories tell that the troll is 7 feet tall, maybe 8, maybe 9. He's a century old at least, maybe 2 centuries. He likes to eat horses, or at least he used to. The age of the automobile hasn't been good for his appetite. He's mad that your car is not a horse. Cross the bridge but keep moving, and stay away from the cemetery too. It's either the ghosts that are all riled up, or maybe just local law enforcement. Either way, it's time to move on to another graveyard, and when we get back from the break, we're making a return visit to Primrose Road.
Ladies and gentlemen, when your day's work is done and you've tipped your cap to the setting sun, there's nothing finer than the brisk, clean taste of Bremen Mint. Why, here in Bremen, or as we call it, Mint City, USA, we distill the very essence of peppermint leaf right from our fertile muck farms. Remember, friends, ghosts may linger, but with Bremen Mint, your breath never will. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
It's a long drive from Bremen to the northern edge of St. Joseph County. Our headlights point a trail back down Primrose Road, and the trail comes with all the same eeriness of a few weeks ago, but there is no woman in white. Instead, there's just quiet as we sail toward the Portage Prairie Dunkards Cemetery. Curiously enough, Little Egypt was in German Township in Marshall County, and wouldn't you know it? Now we're back in St. Joseph County's German Township. Hard to say if it's a coincidence. This graveyard sits along Adams Road about a quarter-mile west of Orange Road. A break in the trees reveals an old burial ground set back from the pavement. The sign reads, Portage Prairie Dunkards Cemetery, but that hasn't always been its name. Over nearly 2 centuries, people have called it Dunkard Cemetery, Ullery Cemetery, even Rough Cemetery. The stones here are old and faded. Some of them are as smooth as glass, worn by time, illegible, forgetting the bodies buried beneath, and if you believe the stories, some of them aren't ready to be forgotten. I don't know much about ghost hunting, but I do know that modern-day ghost hunters report a lot of activity from this cemetery. Whispering voices, spectral orbs, an intense and unshakable feeling of dread that arrives as you step over the threshold into the cemetery. The Dunkards were a branch of the German Baptist Brethren, and their name came from the practice of full immersion baptism, dunking believers completely beneath the water, often in icy creeks or rivers. It was a faith that demanded both conviction and endurance, the kind of devotion you could feel in your bones. Most of those buried here lived quiet agrarian lives. They were farmers, millers, mothers and children, bound together by community and belief. And in death, the stories tell that their ghosts haven't strayed too far from the practices of their first lives. It's said that the ghosts here are not loud, not terribly frightening. They don't chase you, they don't scream. They want little more than they wanted in life: peace, quiet, and to be left alone. So that's what we do, pointing away from the Dunkard Cemetery and back towards South Bend, where we've got a date with a bridge that connects nothing to nowhere, and where a legend tells that the water only flows from some spectral realm on the other side. I don't know how true that part of the story is, but I do know that the history is irresistible. In 1837, Alexis Coquillard, considered by most to be the primary founding father of South Bend, led the charge in an ambitious, if not geologically impossible attempt to redirect the course of a pair of rivers. His belief was that he could build a racing canal between the Kankakee and St. Joseph rivers, an effort that would create a water-powered mill equal if not superior to any establishment west of Rochester, New York. He was wrong. After spending thousands and thousands of dollars to dig a canal and span it with bridges, Coquillard must have watched with trembling disappointment as the water refused to move. There wasn't even a trickle of water from one river that moved into the other. Further attempts to engineer a solution were fruitless, but what they lacked in results, they made up for in cost. Coquillard was bankrupted by the venture, and so were his closest business partners. They'd spent a ton of money, hired a ton of hands, built at least a dozen bridges, and they'd already begun construction on some of the mills that were supposed to harness the scheme's unmatched hydropower. In the years since, all of the mills have been torn down, the dry ditch has been filled, and the bridges that spanned the dry ditch have been removed. All except the one in the cemetery. It's a cute feature, a reminder of the failure of the avarice of man, and if you believe the stories, it's also haunted. I'm not sure who's haunting it. Alexis Coquillard is buried at the Cedar Grove Cemetery at the University of Notre Dame, and when he died in a terrible accident at his flour mill in downtown South Bend in 1855, there were stories that he was haunting the remains of that place, at least for a while. Today, there are no specific stories about the ghost of Alexis Coquillard, just the quiet sounds of the flow of water that never made it beneath the bridge in the city cemetery. Maybe Coquillard never stopped trying to make the adventure a success, and maybe in some other plane of existence he finally found a way to make the water move. Maybe that's why, on days when the threads connecting our dimension to another are especially loose, it's said you can hear the sound of rushing water atop the bridge to nowhere in South Bend City Cemetery. Or maybe it's just the wind.
Be it known that Alexis Coquillard doth now undertake a most extraordinary work of improvement and prosperity, the construction of a mill race and canal to unite the noble Kankakee River with the bountiful waters of the St. Joseph. Gentlemen of means are hereby invited to subscribe shares in this undertaking, the cost being trifling when measured against the vast returns to be reaped. Let no prudent man be found absent from so promising an enterprise. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
I have never heard a single story about the Portage Cemetery being haunted, and that's surprising, because if any dead person in this city ever had a bone to pick with the living, it's probably some of these guys. Hidden back in the woods behind the defunct and gated-up Portage Manor, the Portage Cemetery has had a lot of names over the years. Pottersfield, the St. Joseph County Home Cemetery, but mostly, they just called it the Pauper Cemetery. This was where you went when you couldn't afford to be buried anywhere else, not more than a few 100 feet from the wastewater treatment plant. The unfortunate ones who wound up here got a cardboard box and 6 feet of earth, so long as the ground wasn't too hard. Grave markers were crude and are now often missing. Most of the time it was a concrete cylinder mixed in a coffee can. No name, no dates, just enough to tell the next undertaker to move a few feet to the left. There's already someone under this one. The ghosts of these poor souls ought to have plenty of unfinished business, but then, it's hard to haunt a place when no one visits. The Portage Cemetery is an unwieldy place to find. Technically accessible through the back end of a highway department lot between Chet Wagner Little League and that wastewater treatment plant, every yard of the trip feels like trespassing, even if it's not. When you get there, it looks like a mowed field, and if you didn't know it was a cemetery, you wouldn't guess it. There are at least 1,000 bodies in the ground here, and those are just the ones we have records for. But no, I haven't heard that this cemetery is haunted. That doesn't mean I haven't heard stories. Like the guy from the highway department who told me about the crying widow who showed up just as they were tossing the dirt back onto the man in his box. She begged and pleaded for them to bring him back up and open the box one more time so she could say goodbye. Somehow the entreaty worked. They disinterred the poor fellow and opened his box. The woman snatched the watch off the dead man's wrist and left without a word. Sure seems like that guy might have wanted to do some haunting. The stories get more gruesome from there. A shovel into an unmarked shallow grave bringing forth the awful sound of cracked ribs. Another body fallen off the truck, rolled out of the box and down a hill. Workers at the highway department rushing to call, "Not it." If ghosts are just the spirits of the departed, wronged in life and eager to make sure they're not equally wronged in death, then this should be ground zero for supernatural activity. But it's not. Walter Hutchison, an African-American man stabbed to death with a pair of scissors on Napier Avenue in 1933. So far as I can tell, no one ever faced charges for this one. He's buried at Portage Cemetery. Mary Magdalenska died in 1935. 7 adult children, who between the whole of them couldn't scrape together the funds for a proper burial. August Schabel died in 1932. Sick so long that the only address I could ever find for him was the hospital. The only reason we know that he ever existed is because he died. I'd say any of these had a good enough reason to do some pretty thorough haunting, but it doesn't appear as if they have. Maybe that's why it's here, of all places, that I feel the greatest sense of unease. Because this is the place where people have been forgotten, sometimes on purpose, without so much as a myth or a legend or a lie to keep people coming back. I sit quietly against a tree, on the part of the grounds where there is probably not a person buried a few feet beneath my butt, but then you can never be sure at a place like this. I set a timer on my phone for 16 minutes and 40 seconds. That's 1,000 seconds, one for each person that we know is buried here. It's not much of a remembrance, but it's better than nothing, and it's more than most of them have gotten in a very long time. Hey, thanks for joining us on A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org. I'm your host, Aaron Helman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. Our next episode will head over to Mishawaka for some of the hauntings in that city, and you already know this one's going to involve chips, salsa, and a wet burrito. I hope you'll tune in for that one next. Until then, keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.